Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Dr. Dianeem. I am happy to welcome you to our RSC Lunch and Learn. Today's RSC is with Dr. Ordonez. He is also part of our executive committee, so I'm very happy to welcome him. Dr. Ordonez is the president also of the Research and Innovation Committee and associate professor of political science at the Latin American campus. Um, he is a political scientist and author who specializes in a regional economic integration in Central America. He has conducted research at leading institutions in Latin America and Europe, including fellowships at Stanford University and the University of Cordoba. His academic background includes advanced studies in international relations, public policy, and economics, with a PhD in political science from the University of Milan. All right, welcome everyone. Welcome, Dr. Ordonez, and you can take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Dianeem. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon in this presentation. I would rather say conversation about my research interest. Before I begin, I just wanted to check if the audio is working properly. If
Yes,
anyone
it sounds great.
Awesome. All right. So having said this, I will share my screen, and I will also then just ask you if you could see my presentation.
It's perfect.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I wanted today to have a conversation about this interesting overlap that has been happening recently in Latin America, more particularly in Central America, about this interesting conversation between policy and politics. As Dr. Dianeem said, I've been studying policy at the border level, and I wanted to test some hypotheses regarding whether the implementation or not of certain policies at the border level could create what is known in the literature as integration. Integration seen similarly to what the European Union has been doing over the past 60 years. It's called vertical integration. You have different states, and then you create a confederation and then a federation of states. In the case of Central America, it happened the other way around. We started as a federation, then confederation, then unitary states. And we've been going through a process of reunification for the past 200 years. And the question I'm asking, has been asking in my research over the past 10 years is whether we will reach other types of integration differently from those that are kind of or has been historically expected. So I wanted to kind of share about the cases, talk a little bit about what the region is about. When I say about the region, what Central America is about, and share a bit of the literature review, what the literature says about cross-border development, especially from the policy perspective in Central America. I'll also share the hypothesis I was working with and the methodology I implemented. Then I'm going to share the results and obviously some conclusions. Disclaimer here, I never liked the word conclusion. This is kind of an ongoing process. But for now, this is a kind of a snapshot of the results of the research I conducted before COVID over 5 years ago. And I've been thinking to retake it and then compare the results to see if there has been any progress on the matter. All right, so let's talk about the region, Central America. So this is kind of a map of where we are. This is interesting because I had to present this to my colleagues in Europe. And outside academia, it's really hard for people just to pinpoint where Nicaragua is, where Costa Rica is. They kind of heard, they know where Panama is, kind of. So I think it's always important just to present this in a visual manner. Specifically, the regions or the cities, I was collecting data and gathering information from. So yes, this is kind of the region. It's 6 countries. Belize, it's an interesting case. They belong to the Commonwealth, so they're kind of although they're close to us geographically, they don't consider themselves part of Central America, but rather the Caribbean. So for that purpose, I just left Belize kind of aside regarding the research. So it includes Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, 6 countries. And I wanted to explore more in depth about the cities. So I chose 20 cities and grouped them in pairs, in dyads. So these are the cases. For example, I'm gonna kind of use the pen. In case number 1, I think you could see it, me circling it, is kind of the border city in the Caribbean between Honduras and Guatemala. So in case number 2 was a city between Honduras and Guatemala. On the other side, in case number 3 was Guatemala and El Salvador, and so on and so forth, up until case number 10, which was in the Caribbean part between Panama and Costa Rica. So 20 cities, I worked them in clusters, at the border level, and then I had my cases that were 10 in total. So I review the policies implemented at the border level, first individually in each of the cities, and then to see if there had joint policies. And I had some conversation with the policymakers at the local level, and then some conversation at the central level, the central government, to see their perspective, how it is that they understood integration at the border level. Because as I said earlier, the literature in terms of integration, it's been saturated from the European perspective. So everything that it resembles integration is often compared with the European cases. But I would argue that we at the level of Central America, we're generating our own sort of or process of integration that has to be recognized and studied properly. And then we'll see that there's a high variation of institutional elements, this famous North and South. It also applies here, but the other way around. We will see that countries that are in the North, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, has completely different dynamic from the countries in the South, especially Costa Rica and Panama. Nicaragua is considered kind of an outlier here, but for interesting cases as well. We'll see kind of the results when we get there. So I was interested in analyzing what was known as the horizontally integrated spaces, the HIS. And these are known as cross-border areas in which development policies are created and implemented. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, here we are. And implemented. So it creates a complement to the existing efforts of regional integration in Central America, known as SICA. In Spanish is Sistema de Integración Centroamericano, that has been, as I said earlier, has been mimicking or emulating the integration efforts conducted by Europe in the last 60 years. So this is more the SICA perspective is more kind of a formal bureaucratic perspective of integration, in which the paradigm is to create a confederation and eventually a federation. Whereas this approach I'm tackling here is more kind of horizontal, is more at the border levels, because the borders creates dynamics that are very similar to the ones generated by the SICA perspective, let's say, or the vertical integration. So I just wanted to see compare them, and then to see what are kind of the variables or the conditions that allow this form of integration to happen. And it turns out that there are four of them. Okay, there are four main conditions. Methodologically speaking, and here I wanted to raise a footnote that in terms of statistics, these would be known, as the independent variables. However, the methods I'm using are FSQCA. We'll get there in a minute, and they call them conditions instead of variables. But they're pretty much the same. I mean, I could use the terms interchangeably, and it doesn't change much. But this is kind of for the audience, in case one was wondering, because I had this question before, what to call them conditions and not variables. They're pretty much the same. So there are four of them. So I had homogeneous political ideology, and the assumption here is that it doesn't matter whether the ideology of the central government belongs to the right wing or left wing, as long as they're the same. So here, for example, if I have two countries with the same ideology, I repeat, regardless whether from the left or the right, they would have kind of a better relations at the border level, vis-a-vis those who are from different, political ideology. So the second variable and assumption here, there is a diverse socioeconomic status working, and this is kind of incentives for people to go from one place to the other. So this happens a lot at the borders of, for example, Nicaragua and Costa Rica, where people from Nicaragua go to Costa Rica to work, and then they come back to their home country. And this happens at the border level. So there are dynamics there in which people commute from one country to the other, and there is kind of flexibility set in place at the border that allows this to happen. But for that, there needs to be a priori, obviously, diverse socioeconomic status between one country and the other. The third condition and assumption is that there is a shared territorial problem, and this is true for countries that share, for example, at the border level, there is a river, or there are protected areas in which both countries need to implement policies, to overcome that problem in case there is a problem, or just to find a solution. Again, cases, for example, there is a protected reserve in the border between Costa Rica and Panama. So these countries kind of at the border level implement policies that enables, let's say, integration of some sorts vis-a-vis other countries in which they have nothing in common when it comes to the territory. And then the fourth variable is decentralization. And this is a key component because, again, the premise here, the assumption is that the more decentralized the local government versus the central governments are, the better the policies. It's going to be easier for the local governments to create and implement their policies if they're more autonomous, or if they have a higher level of decentralization. So the hypothesis, when I identified this variable, the hypothesis was kind of a common sense. So the set of the causal conditions of these variables could facilitate the creation of the cross-border development policies. And obviously, once they're implemented, they could foster economic, social, and political cooperation between governments at the local level. Notice that I'm not using the word integration, and I'm not using it on purpose, right? Because one of the purposes here is to challenge this idea that integration could be something else than, the usual formal perspective of a bureaucracy that is creating these supranational institutions. So the recent literature, the scholarship kind of is opening, is becoming more and more increasingly flexible, to the sense that the word integration was really important back in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s. But then there are other ways in which you could integrate quote unquote policies or political dynamics without necessarily referring to the word, again, because it's loaded with the European experience. So the literature is trying to perform an exorcism, so to say, on the word, and try to find other ways in which governments could collaborate or communicate without necessarily integrating in the formal sense. So this is where the methodology, the FSQCA, kicks in, because then I wanted to create a model that could explain this. And then I just needed to identify before creating the model, wanted to see what to expect actually of what the literature was telling me. So I'd identify, let's say, two meta variables or two big conditions. I wanted to see whether the context matters, to create the cross-border for the cities to create cross-border development policies. So I wanted to see whether, if you look here, we have two sorts of possibilities. Either the governments are politically engaged or not politically engaged when it comes to the context. And then obviously I had to look at the local level, the local factors. On the local level, I wanted to see whether they were policy driven or not policy driven. So once that you create the matrix, you have four possible solutions, right? And the solutions in which it is expected for me to find through the model policies at the border level was when, we had political engagement at the central level, plus the local level implements or have this policy driven perspective vis-a-vis or with respect to the other cities. So we have whenever you have these two things, in place, then you have this sufficient combination, or what I call the presence of the CBDP, the cross-border development policies. The methodology is kind of mixed methods. This is a methodology. It was really popular in Europe. That this is kind of a side joke, another footnote here, that my American colleagues don't like that much. They prefer the old school linear regression models and with large numbers of n, and to review the R square and adjusted R square, which is it's fine. I really like that as well. Europeans are more focused on mixed methods. Ironically, the FSQCA was something that an American scholar created, Professor Charles Ragan from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. So I had the chance to talk to him. He was touring in Europe years ago, and he was kind of presenting this methodology to European universities. And it so happens that when I was doing my doctoral studies in Milan, he was there a semester and pretty much convinced the faculty of political science to actually to try to see what happens whenever you implement this methodology, vis-a-vis the regular statistical analysis. Because the advantage of QCA versus, for example, running a linear regression, simple or multiple regressions, is the fact that it allows you to work with lower number of observations. You don't require necessarily, big ends. The downside is, like, obviously then you can say it represents all of the cases, or it could be replicable in other spaces, but rather you focus on smaller samples and then you analyze kind of what's going on in that particular, region or space, locality, so to say. But the analogies are similar. So this is it was quite fun, quite interesting. And obviously it opens a door to analyze these phenomena that has been, again, usually analyzed through the lenses of the legal system, from the legal's perspective, the law, or more kind of running economic analysis. Economists tend to um, build their econometric models and all of that. So I wanted to try something different, and this would be hopefully my contribution in terms of the methods as well, a new way to understand integration in Central America. So there are like the two-step approach because I wanted obviously to see, as I presented earlier, the matrix. I had remote and proximate conditions, and it covers as well important concepts such as causal depth and causal mechanisms. But I wanted to explore the causality element, and I would assume that this is my intuition. This is why, for example, this method is really discussed in lots of circles because the rule number one on statistics, correlation does not mean causation. Obviously true. FSQCA wants to kind of push that boundary and say, okay, let's see then if there is causation as well. So for that, we have to reduce the number of observations of n and see what happens, whether, these variables or conditions affect your dependent variable. That's kind of what I wanted to see. And deals with logical remainders, empty cells in the truth table. These means that logical remainders are something that are theoretically true, but they are not observed or were not observed in reality. So one of the advantages of SQCA is kind of it tells you what to do with those cases. These theoretical cases that could have happened but didn't, and this is a methodological pitfall that I think I kind of avoided when using this methodology, FSQCA. So the outcome, what I wanted to observe, the dependent variable was as I said earlier, the cross-border development policies, and to see whether the factors that were analyzed previously triggered or enabled or allowed the existence of these policies that created these horizontally integrated spaces. So whenever a policy was observed in the cases, the next step was to see what type of policy we were talking about, because they're not the same. So we had environmental policies in place, and these obviously are the ones that are focused on prevention of natural disasters and everything that has to do with the geography. And this is true, for example, in some cases, as I said earlier, the case of Panama and Costa Rica. We had security policies in place that had to do with drug trafficking, violence. This is really common in the countries located at the north, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, which has been historically, they have had problems related to gangs and drug trafficking and violence overall. And then we had generic development poverty policies, that these are set in place to fight against high levels of social exclusion, economic inequalities. This is true for certain borders between Guatemala and Honduras, if I'm not mistaken, and Nicaragua and Costa Rica. So there were kind of the three big kind of types of policies that were observed whenever and actually they were mathematically present too in the analysis. So this is kind of digging deeper into the FSQCA, as Fossey said, qualitative comparative analysis. And we needed to create a score membership that goes, is a ratio from 0 to 1. So 1 means that you observed completely, the policy is there, it's implemented through cross-border cooperation, and then it goes down in different levels, So for the score membership, we have the matching policy cycle. So if the value is 1, it means that you have your policy in place and you created border integration. If it's point A to point 9, you have in the policy cycle, you haven't completed or achieved a horizontally integrated space, but you're almost there. So you're in the phase of the policy analysis. And then if you go lower, you go into the policy implementation. if you go lower into the policy design, and so on and so forth, until you reach the value 0 or close to 0, in which you say, well, there's nothing set in place. So one of the challenges was actually then to determine, from your score from 0 to 1, what was the matching policy cycle there, and obviously the proper explanation for those cases. And the conditions, I'm not going to stop here. I'm going to share the PowerPoint, the presentation, if you're interested. But here I wanted to kind of see more in details what they meant. So whenever I was analyzing, for example, the homogeneous political ideologies, as I said earlier, the closer to governments or to states or to countries are, ideologically speaking, the easier it'll be for them to implement policies at the border level. And then I had to go into sub-variables, so to say. So I had to see whether the politics at the macro level, was the same from one country to the next, whether the politics at the micro level was the same from one city to the next, whether to see there were existing cooperation policies to begin with, and so on and so forth. So I had to actually go a little bit deeper in details into when it comes to that. So I'm going to present, for the purpose of this conference, kind of the main elements for each one of the conditions. When it comes to ideology, these are the ones. So I had 4, let's say, sub-conditions or sub-variables. When it comes to diverse socioeconomic status, I measured income, occupation, and education. These are kind of the recommended variables to analyze by the literature when you're seeing the incentive from people to migrate, for example, to commute from one place to the other. They did it because the other place had better jobs, income, occupation, or better kind of education. So this is kind of the variables I was analyzing for this condition. When it comes to territorial problems, I wanted to see whether the existence of problems were exogenous. For example, Central America is very common for having, I don't know, earthquakes, natural disasters or hurricanes, so you have these things happening at the border level. And I wanted to analyze whether this was triggered from exogenous factors, or maybe you have something that is happening at the border, something created or induced by people, and to see whether the policy had the same approach. And there is a more kind of psychological perspective here as well, to see whether these were acknowledged by the local government. And finally, the decentralization level means, obviously, if there are plans from the central government vis-a-vis the local government. So there are countries in which, they're highly decentralized. I put highly, quote unquote, quotation mark, because these are small countries. It doesn't make much sense from the perspective of the public administration to have high levels of decentralization. But some countries, they do have them. For example, Costa Rica and Panama, compared to the rest of the countries, they have a higher level of decentralization. And obviously, the important thing here is whether the local governments have the flexibility or ability to create policies or not, or whether they're just strictly dependent of what the central government wants or is planning to do at the border level. So once you analyze these 4 big conditions or variables with every detail, every sub-variable in each of these kind of 4 big ones, so to say, then we create the model. Again, if this was a traditional regression analysis, we would have the y equals and then our coefficients, beta sub 0 plus beta 1 x1 and so on and so forth. Here is very similar in the sense that I was working with a model that allows four big variables, and then which are here macropolitics and common social issues and territorial problems and decentralization, the ones I just explained in the previous matrices. And then I have my dependent variable, my cross-border development policies. So through FSQCA, I wanted to see whether the interaction of these four big variables created or not policies. And it was not binary, and this is one of the beautiful things. If it works in a fuzzy set, right? And from scales from 0 to 1, from ranges, so it's not binary in the sense that you could see either presence or absence, but you could see it at what level the present is the policy is present, in the sense that if the result, I'm just an example, was 0.6, then in the policy cycle where that particular policy is what's the phase, so to say. Maybe it's in the phase of creation, maybe it's already implemented, maybe it's in the evaluation, maybe it already created something resembling integration between the borders. So it allows you to actually know where the policy is standing. So again, this is kind of a very interesting methodology. It allows you to have a clear picture of where the policy is and what particular moment in time. Very briefly, so I created the truth table. Whenever I observed a presence of a variable, I just marked 1. Whenever there was absence of a variable, it was marked 0. And then whenever there was presence or absence of the policies, it was either 1 or 0. So I had created the truth table. The software calculated the consistency levels, which said consistency above 0.6 means that it is more likely than not to observe the policy. So 0.6 was kind of the recommended threshold here. And then we could see that in at least kind of 5 or 6 cases, we kind of saw the implementation of a policy that could potentially become a horizontally integrated space. So the truth table allow me to clear up the noise, actually. Remember the logical remainders and all of those cases that were theoretically possible but might not have been observed. So it kind of allows me to more or less shake that off, clean the noise and actually observe and analyze whatever was present here. So what am I looking at here? What are we looking at? And real quick, so once you tell the software, that 1 is true in the truth table for the policies and 0 is false, the software generated what was known as the solutions for coverage and consistency. So if you could draw your attention at these numbers, then it would be awesome. The consistency is very similar to what in statistics would be the adjusted R squared. How much variability is explained by the selected independent variables, 96%. However, if you see the coverage, it means that percentage of cases was 0.74, which means 74% of cases were observed to have the variables I selected. Interestingly, FSQCA allows you to pick from different solutions. Okay, so it's a permutation of variables at the same time. So the software tells you, so you have lots of solutions, right? And with different coverage and consistency levels. Now it is your duty, well, our duty as researchers, to see whether they fit reality, because they could present counterfactuals, they could present something, again, that only works mathematically, but maybe there is no empirical proof of that, right? So at the end, well, I'll show you later. What this was telling me up front was a couple of things. It's actually kind of the findings or the discoveries I was kind of aiming at when I started doing the analysis. The first thing that it was telling me is that cross-border development policies can actually be explained by 6 different combinations, so to say, of remote proximate configurations. What does it mean? So we have 6 possible solutions, and I just needed to see whether these made theoretical and solutions with an elevated consistency level, with a elevated coverage level. So I just wanted to confirm whether the mathematics, was kind of making sense with the observations. And it proved conjectural causation, equifinality in the results. These are technicalities of the FSQCA. Sorry, I think I lost connection. Can you guys confirm if you could still see the presentation, please?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, we
I'm
can.
sorry. I'm sorry. Apologies. And then I had 3 possible solutions: the complex solution, intermediate solution, and the parsimonious solution. Now, again, the software doesn't tell me which solution to pick. It should be us, and this is the art of understanding research methods. I just have to see which one explains whatever I was analyzing the best way possible. And I chose the parsimonious solution, the famous Okun's razors principle. The easier the explanation, they tend to be kind of the better. The parsimonious, the simpler the better. So remember, I had 6 solutions, and only 2 of them actually were empirically observed, 2 configurations, right? And then this is really interesting because I just put them here by side just to compare, both coverage and consistency. Because in solution one, I have a combination of the variables explained 91% of the cases. However, they're at the consistency level, they could only explain 80%. It was 0.8, 80% of the variability. Right? So I could say, or I could fall into the temptation to make my model kind of more complex, just to keep adding variables. The problem with that is, and in statistics, the same happens, R squared will tend to grow. However, my coverage will tend to go down. So this is a trade-off that we need to be really careful, whether kind of if it's worth or not, making that exchange. On the other hand, this is the personally I like the most. It had a coverage of 85%, so it's a bit lower. 85% of the cases were explained by this configuration. However, the consistency was 0.93, 0.9, which is really high. It's really good. So 93% of the variability was explained by these variables. This means the absence of a variable and the presence of the rest. So theoretically speaking, what is the mathematics telling me? So there wasn't actually overlap between this policy and politics perspective, insofar as the governments agree and engage into cross-border cooperation. So there needs to be a political will, first and foremost. These types of governments are usually decentralized, in some policy areas, but centralized in others. There's another interesting thing. So again, it's not binary. A government could have more flexibility in some areas. Let's say I can easily allow the local government to implement policy areas in terms of environment. However, when it comes to security, I will handle them at the central level. So both the mathematics, the statistical analysis, and the empirical observations actually agree there. We could observe both things. And the macro political context is a sine qua non, so to say, condition. Is a key characteristics for the right implementation of cross-border policies. I mean, it again, the characteristics of these states of Central America, small, unitary, with really centralized governments, really you have the presence of the as a strong central government was a key condition for the implementation of cross-border development policies. So this type of policies imply specific outcomes. So this is interesting because then we could open the debate regarding what it means to understand the process and the creation and implementation of policies. Not any sort of policies. Again, here I just want to underline that the dynamics are different because we're talking about two different countries. So the border element is a really important element here that allows you then to determine whether or not these countries are creating some sort of integration or bringing the benefits of integration to the people. And policies cannot be considered or analyzed separately from their institutional context in which they're applied. And interestingly, from all of the policies existing, only the ones that regarding tourism or the environment seems to create the highest level of agreement at the local level. Kind of also makes sense. I mean, they're not very sensitive policies that are planned or implemented at the central level. So the central governments allowed flexibility when it comes to that. So real quick, and this is kind of the final slide, some conclusions or let's say final thoughts on the status of integration process in Central America. I think this is important and it has been overlooked both by the literature and the policymakers at the central level. There are dynamics happening at the local level, at the border level, that I think require attention, from academia, from NGOs, from policymakers, to see, whether policies could be implemented that would allow, the free not free, flexible circulation of people, and bring all of the benefits of integration, economic integration at the border level. Theoretically speaking, it's also interesting because then we could see how the different types of policies trigger different types of responses, both at the central and local government. And it invites us just to analyze policies differently, knowing that, again, the nature of the policy could have different results. It allows you or makes you think actually more in context whether these policies could, at the end, promote something with the other, let's say, neighboring cities or not. Methodologically speaking, I was trying to push the boundaries of QCA, analyzing it from, again, making the comparisons with the traditional, linear, simple, or multiple regressions. The conversation of these two methods are nonetheless interesting. There are lots of papers and conferences with the pros and cons of the FSQCA. As I said earlier, it is a very appealing methodology in Europe. Lots of European research centers like UCA. This is not very, at least from the American universities, this is not very popular. And again, the irony, it was like Charles Reagan, an American scholar from UCLA, was the one who invented this method. And so, yeah, I think it's really, really interesting. It's novel. And at least in the political sciences, it's kind of, it shows you from a different perspective, new ways to understand political reality. And limits, lessons learned, pending issues. As I said, this was implemented before COVID, and obviously the dynamics with the quarantine, what happened at the borders, some borders and countries isolated themselves vis-a-vis others. This kind of put a new insights to kind of this whole thing. So it would be interesting to collect the data again, right? And just to compare actually what happens with these policies if this COVID, let's say, element kind of weakening or strengthen some policies perspective or development at the border level or not. And so yeah, it would be interesting to kind of rerun the analysis with kind of more recent data, updated data, and see what happens. Thank you for your attention. I really hope it was kind of interesting. I just hope I just didn't overwhelm you with lots of stuff, but this is kind of what's been going on when it comes to my research interest. Thank you a lot for your time. Obviously, if you have questions, observations, recommendations, I would like to hear maybe from the method perspective or the theory perspective, new insights. I'll just take note and see how I could squeeze them into my upcoming research project. So thank you all for your attention, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Ordonez. If there are any questions, now is the time, or comments. You could post them in the chat or unmute. We have a few minutes for that. Charles, I see you speaking, but we can't hear you.
Maybe the mic is not prop. No, the microphone is not working, I guess.
Yes, Charles, we see you. You want to try again to unmute yourself? Yeah. We can't hear you.
Maybe if he rejoins the conference, probably it'll work. Not sure.
Yeah. I see Boris.
Thank you, Dr. Diane. I'm Dr. Ordonez. I have a simple, not very simple question, but I was involved in a couple of years ago helping a doctoral student in political science in Serbia in Europe. And they had the issues with the migration and big thing in Europe, in Germany, and all of them. It was a big mess. Well, we discovered something very interesting, which we didn't pay attention. I didn't pay attention in the past. There is some big humps in the curves in the population curves in Germany and Russia, and but they lost millions of people in World War II. And there was I insisted that we should go with the quantitative analysis, which turned to be okay at the end. Well, but what I wanted to ask you, do you think that Central America is at this point of time stable region, much more stable than Europe at this point of time in terms of immigration and migrations?
Wow, that's a great question. I would say yes and no, and obviously my answer would have some caveats. I think that under the Trump administration, there has been a recent problem, which say with the historical trends of migration going from Central America to the north. But I don't think migration will stop, in the sense that even if the country of destiny will no longer be the United States, the dynamics of migration will go somewhere elsewhere, either South America or Europe. And this is something that has been happening, and I think will continue to happen in the future, as long as during the Trump administration. I don't know if a future administration for the United States will be more flexible, in which case, all should we redirect it back to the north. Now, having said this, there has been interesting situations happening domestically in the countries that have, in a way, diminished the trend of migrations compared to other moments. So, for example, the security situation in El Salvador is no longer as dangerous as it was 5 or 6 years ago. So that has created a situation in which people no longer see the need to go elsewhere for security reasons. I'm not saying that people are not migrating, but they're not doing it, in the percentage that it happened maybe 10 years ago. And something similar is happening in Guatemala and Honduras as well. So there are things happening domestically. They're actually absorbing a percentage, not by much, of the natural migrants that would go elsewhere to seek better life opportunities and all of that. So there's a combination of conditions, let's say an anti-migration policy from Trump perspective, and some changes happening domestically in some countries that were historically seen as dangerous in terms of security, but are no longer the case. There are kind of containing, more or less, the migration patterns in the region. That doesn't mean, obviously, that migration will stop, or it just tells you that maybe momentarily it will not be a big thing compared to other moments in history. Now, having said this, there is another important component, is the remittances. I don't know, in the case of Serbia in Europe, works the same, but a large chunk of our GDP depends on remittances. So in a way, these countries depend on their migrants, for economic stability. So there is I just say it, obscure paradox, because on the one hand, again, at least at the political level, the political discourse is that they don't want migrants to go, but that we country depend on them, you know. So as long as that variable is active, as long as we depending on remittances, I think it'll always be the case. But again, I mean, the incentives are changing. As I said earlier, maybe security is no longer a key component, but that does not mean that migration will disappear. Maybe just a few percentages compared to the historical trends, but it'll remain for sure.
Well, thank you very much. I completely agree with your statement, and it's similar, somewhat similar. Many of this migration that's happening just because of GDP depends on the migrants
Yeah,
sending money back,
yeah,
and then we cannot, it's gonna stay. It's no way it's gonna go away. But
yeah.
issues like the wars and stuff like that creates a certain rushes on the one point of time when they go and they come back, and that's normal. Thank you very much for your answer. Thank
No,
you.
thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay.
Hello, this is Charlie Muzzy again. I found a switch that I had in the wrong position. Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, wonderful, great. Actually, a technical question. What software are you using?
Oh, it's called I'm just gonna write it here, FSQCA. You Google it and then you could download. It's kind of free online. It's an open source. So I always kind of suggest my peers just to navigate it, to see, you know, what it does and all of that. So yeah, there is a, I think there is a version that I think you have to pay a license or something that allows you kind of, but the free version is quite useful for what I just did here. So yeah.
Okay, so have you looked at our go-to softwares, SPSS? Would that work for what you're doing?
Yes, yes. The data sets, for example, if I run it with other softwares, SPSS, Stata, I haven't tried R or Python, you know, on kind of, at least for example with the Stata version, when I was comparing the R square vis-a-vis the consistency, they were very similar. The problem with, for example, this software that requires large observations is that it's not reliable if I use the standard statistical packages. So FSQCA kind of allows, let's say, observations from, I think it was the minimum is 5 up to 60, because after 60, then, you know, the results are not reliable either. So one of the things I have pending, actually, apropos of what Dr. Massey is saying, is to see whether, you know, I could replicate this with a data set in other softwares and see what happens, you know, whether, you know, the results are more than mathematical coincidence or actually is telling me something else that FSQCA is not. So actually, I think that's a good point.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you, doctor.
Okay, I think if that's everything, we are really out of time. This was amazing. I so appreciate your time, Dr. Ordonez, and
Thank you.
everyone for being here. This was a wonderful presentation. We have recorded it, so it should be posted soon. And we appreciate you, and we appreciate you all. I hope you enjoyed the RSC and hope you come again.
Thank you for coming. Have a
Thank
great
you.
afternoon. Bye-bye.